Everyone, welcome to HOA Fight Club. I'm Raylene Stefano. Today I want to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act and a few other things that I've been working on. I was reading through the results and actually the filing with the Corporate Transparency Act. And what I saw was, CAI is fighting because we shouldn't have to disclose personal information and it violates constitutional rights of people having to give up personal information. So as I was reading through it, I noticed that the people that have to give up the personal information would be the board members that have controlling interest, and so they'd have to supply their driver's license or their passport. And each time a board member changes, they'd have to update that. So that would be, if there's annually or yearly. So that was one of the burdens that they said CAI was putting on there, that we shouldn't have to give up our personal information because it violates our constitutional rights. CEI doesn't always fight for constitutional rights. So that was the first thing that kind of stopped me, because violation of constitutional rights happen all the time in HOA, and the Constitution is never really mentioned in these associations because they're their own little personal private contracts. And so the Constitution doesn't matter. But it does matter when it comes to having to disclose personal information, apparently, to CAI. They have a problem with that. The other thing that was one of the requirements was 25% ownership. So let's be honest about 25% ownership. Who does that include? Well, that includes the developer, because he'll own over 25%, until a certain time that he doesn't own 25%. It would be an investor, I would say in a condo association, or maybe a small plat community that only has like 4 homes that each owner owns 25%, or somebody that would own a big portion of a community. You don't see that a lot. You don't see a lot of individual homeowners that own more than a percentage. Some of the declarations actually limit that. And if that is a concern of community associations institute, that 25% is a big, they don't want to report that. I would say that the governing documents are amended. That would be my advice. I do see governing documents that limit how much membership you can own. My personal governing documents limited us to 10%. So the other thing that comes to mind was CAI's fight for we won't get people to serve on the board. I have never had an issue with finding board members to serve. And if there is an issue finding board members to serve, they're worried that the association would be dissolved or go into receivership. Well, if nobody will serve in a corporation, that corporation shouldn't exist in the first place. That corporation should be dissolved if they can't get anyone to serve on the board. There should be, especially in an HOA, like a plat community where it's, individual homes. If there's nobody that wants to serve on the corporation board, they should dissolve that corporation. If there's common areas, they could sell off the common areas and the utilities go back to the city. Of course, the cities and the counties don't want that because they're not having to pay for those responsibilities anymore, and they've put that off onto the community. Now your utilities would go back to being run by the city, and that would put a burden back on them for your tax dollars being paid to take care of those facilities and services in the first place. So I don't see eye to eye. Now, condominium, if that goes into a receivership or dissolution, that means that the owners are responsible for their own places. Now, they do share common walls, and that's something they would have to determine, but it isn't. I don't see a mass exodus because we have to give a driver's license to serve on a board of directors. Is there money laundering happening in associations? Well, maybe not for terrorism, but how do we know what's happening? There's not, CAI uses our, Records Act that we have, the Records Act, there's transparency already, but that's really hard to get a lot of records. If you do a request for records in an association, you don't usually get them right away. I've had very few associations that voluntarily just give up all the records of the association. I mean, I had to fight for, oh gosh, probably a year to get the records of my association. So there isn't corporate transparency like they're saying. Yeah, they have laws on the books, but those laws aren't being enforced. And where is the accountability? See, with the Corporate Transparency Act, now if you don't report these things, you get a civil penalty, which should be the same as what we're doing in these corporations in the state, that if they don't report or they don't turn over records, there should be a civil penalty. So that is something that we have been trying to say all along, that there should be civil penalties for the failure to act. Now, of course, CAI doesn't want this. Well, of course, CAI doesn't want a mass exodus of boards and dissolution of corporations because the industry relies on these corporations. They have unrestrained power over these corporations, and if there's a mass exodus of boards, well, they can't be hired. Attorneys can't be hired, right? Property managers can't be hired. If there's no association, there's no attorneys, there's no property managers, there's no enforcement. So I think that that's really where they're worried about. Again, 25%, that's the developer, that's an investor. I do see investors. I see a lot of investors that own over 25% of a condominium association, and they're serving on the board, and they have their property management company running the corporation. And I could see a lot of money laundering maybe happening. How do we know what's happening? Because there's no governance or oversight. There's nobody checking these corporations to make sure they are doing what's right. Nonprofit reporting for IRS and all that kind of stuff, it's real easy to say, yeah, we used all this for this, but there's a lot of things that happened that I think that would be disclosed that could show the money laundering. We don't know what's happening because we're not being able to check that. Homeowners can't check that. And they're not being given the records that they're supposed to be given. So I do have an issue with them that, and I don't think you're going to see a mass exodus of board members. There's too many people that like that control. I don't think we've had any issues with finding board members. And again, if there is an issue with finding board members and no members want to participate in the association should be dissolved. And actually, if there's no participation, the association will be automatically dissolved because nobody will be reporting it to the Secretary of State. And then the Secretary of State automatically dissolves the corporation. So I think there's some things that we could look at. Now let's talk about CAI's opinion of the Constitution. They do mention that HOAs are creatures of the state, which to me sounds like they're trying to say that the states create these laws, so the federal government shouldn't have any say of what they do. There shouldn't be any creatures of the state. The federal government and the federal Constitution should be over everything. Is the federal government invading our personal privacy by asking for ID? We have to have ID to do a lot of different things. You have to show your ID to rent an apartment. I mean, is the board taking things? Here's a nonprofit association that has rentals in it. The board is demanding that you turn over that they do background checks, that they have ID to rent a place in there, that the association is given that ID. The association takes social security numbers, they put liens on, and they have foreclosure. So they have a lot of our personal information. I've asked, my association demanded that I give them my loan number, my insurance number for my condo insurance. So there's a lot of paperwork that is the invasion of the privacy of the personal homeowner also. So these associations are saying they don't want to give up their driver's license or their passport to serve on a board, but they're more than willing to take our driver's licenses and things like that to put in their records for their own personal use, which I think is more of an invasion of privacy than the actual federal government asking for a list of who's serving on a board and identification. These associations don't even do background checks. Anybody can serve as long as they're an owner of this in an association. I don't know of any states that do background checks in HOA. So, like you said, they're uneducated volunteers. That means they could have no education on how to run financials, and they could be having, there could be money laundering happening. How do we know with no governance or oversight? So, if anybody's afraid to give away their ID, their driver's license as ID, I would have concerns for them serving on the board in the first place. I think there should be background checks. I think there should be more burden put on these boards. The Volunteer Board Act type, federal act is, not to keep these people from being responsible for their decisions, but it is there to protect them so that if they're making good decisions, that they're not held to a different standard than the regular homeowners. We're all volunteers in these communities. I don't know if these communities should be ran by uneducated volunteers. This is your biggest investment of your lifetime, and you shouldn't trust just anybody on a board. I would be very concerned now knowing what I know of who's running your association, because I know my board, there was money missing. I found 120 some $1,000 missing one year just from the turnover from one property manager to another property manager, and nobody was ever held responsible. So where did that money, would that be considered money laundering? I think that instead of just looking at the board members having to give ID, I think the property manager should have to give ID. And I think that the attorneys running those and acting as agents should also have to give those IDs up, because I think they should be held to the same responsible. There should be a fiduciary duty between the property manager and the association. That property manager is handling your money and they are not FDIC insured and they don't have any, in Washington state, you don't even have to be licensed. The other thing I have an issue with is they say that you get this information in resale documents. Well, resale documents are very, very vague and they're not always up to date. We just had this conversation in legislation talks with CAI representatives, the lobbying group in Washington State. We sat down and we tried to define what current is. What is a current reserve study? Is the current reserve study when the contractor finishes it? Is that what the current reserve study is? Is it when the invoice is sent to the board? Does the board have the right to hold that reserve study for 90 days, for a year to approve it? When does it have to be? They couldn't, the lobbyists couldn't even ask or define current. If you can't even define what current is or when a reserve study should be published, we, the homeowners, pay for those items. We pay for a reserve study, and in paying for that reserve study, it should be published within 30 days of that reserve study being finished, no matter whether the board approves of it or not, because they can contest it, but they should have to contest it in a public meeting. They should not be able to keep it a secret. And what does current mean? Current financials, is it within 90 days? Is it 120 days? I mean, we have definitions, but if the board hasn't approved the budget or the, meeting minutes haven't been approved, are they not current? So there's a lot of issues, and I see a lot of potential ways to have some sort of money laundering going on in these community associations. And I think that CAI is being very blind to the fact, if they really truly believe there isn't money laundering. Now, is it going to terrorism? I don't think so. But how do we know if we don't even know what to look for in these communities? If there's a developer or an investor that owns 25%, how do we know if they're not coming from another country and they have bad intentions or bad acts in mind? I do know there's a lot of bad acts without the federal or without the terrorist out there. There's a lot of bad acts just with boards. Not every association is bad. There's a lot of really good run associations that have proper, they'll give up records, they'll do what they're supposed to do. But there's also a lot of bad associations. We wouldn't be here if there wasn't a lot of bad associations out there and bad boards with not really good intent. I just got a client the other day that the governing documents aren't even recorded with the county. They've been enforcing governing documents since 2004. They're not recorded with the county and they are not even signed, they're not notarized. So who's holding these people responsible? Who's telling this association what to do? Who's monitoring their money? If they don't even know that their governing documents aren't valid, how are they keeping track of our money? I think that we need to have more transparency, not less transparency. And the fact that CAI is fighting so hard to keep transparency out of it, and not that I agree or disagree with the Transparency Act or have an opinion on exactly all the details of that act, I do see that there's issues with transparency and we need to say something. We need to participate. We need to be involved. And I have to say again, if that association has a mass exodus and nobody wants to serve on the board, then it should be dissolved. There shouldn't be a corporation if the members don't want to participate. That is just another way for the industry to make money by putting it into receivership and collecting that money for those homeowners and jeopardizing their homes even further. We have a lot of invasion of privacy. Our invasion of privacy is every day if you live in an HOA or especially a condo association. But I see homeowners being fined every day for things that shouldn't be happening, and they're held to arbitrary and capricious rules and fines and fees, and they're not being protected. Their constitutional rights aren't being protected. So why is CAI so worried about the constitutional rights of the board members to turn over their driver's license or their passport as ID for serving on a corporate board? All right, you guys, I'll see you on the next one.